All right, and then I'm going to move everything down. All right, guys, so we are in, this is the fifth week. Yes, the fifth week. And we're going to be talking about knowledge, evidence, and certainty tonight. Those are important to kind of what we're trying to accomplish here in our apologetic search. And so, just a review of last week, you know, again, if you don't know these things, if they don't ring a bell, go back and review everything. But last week we talked about different objections. We talked about the common simplistic objection. We talked about philosophical objections, and then we also talked about some biblical or theological objections to doing apologetics. And we really kind of shot all those down. And I believe your book, Bealby, talks a lot about some of these too. So that should be very familiar material for you by now. And then we also talked about, because I wanted to start talking about where our knowledge of God starts to intersect, where faith and reason intersect. I wanted to describe to you the primarily the three different views, the three most popular views on the relationship between faith and reason in contention. We talked about how reason is deceptive in this type of system. We talked about faith and reason synthesis. This is the Thomas Aquinas system where faith and reason are used as parts of grace of God. And just because man is sinful does not diminish his reason necessarily. It's still graced by God. And then we talked about faith seeking understanding, which is the classic Augustinian view. Talked about how we come to certain truths of the Christian faith by faith, and then we better understand those truths through reason. We talked about the Trinity in that. And so, for our agenda tonight, I don't have many books to give you guys tonight, but if you're interested in reading more about those three views that we talked about last week, one of the books that I've read on this is called Faith and Reason, Three Views. It's edited by Steve Wilkins. He's the general editor. It's because there are three different scholars who are writing in this book. It's if you've ever read any of the classic Zondervan counterpoint books, it's a lot like that, where you have a scholar kind of writes his piece, and it's very approachable language. It's nothing that's too difficult. It might take a little bit of work to get through it, but it's not something I believe any of you, if you've been able to read the stuff in this class, you would be able to read this book and understand it. But the scholar, he'll present his essay, and then the other two will criticize his viewpoint, and then the original scholar will then go back and respond to the criticism. And so each one does that, and they present those three different views. And also, this is kind of a broadening of our theological horizons on here, because none of those guys in that book are Calvinists. So that's kind of that's good to see. We want to see how other evangelicals respond to it. All three of the writers are broadly evangelical, and so it's good. It's not a bad book to have. I read it for school, and I think it's something that's worth reading. Also, for tonight, we're going to talk about knowledge. We're going to talk about what it means to gain knowledge of God. We're going to talk about epistemology and evidence. We've already talked a lot about those, so a lot of this should be review, or a lot of this should trigger, things that I've said in previous classes. So we're going to talk a little bit about Reformed epistemology. Again, we've already talked about that in this class, but mainly why I want to talk about that is because I want to present another epistemological system called covenantal epistemology. And then we're going to talk about the problem of certainty. We're going to talk about what is really two types of certainty: logical certainty, as well as moral or psychological certainty, and what the difference is between those, and how we can interact with those two different kinds of certainty. And then lastly, we're going to talk about what certainty means for the practice of natural theology or the practice of apologetics. Do we have to be 100% logically certain of all of our arguments for the existence of God? Do we have to be 100% logically certain about our faith in God? Or is there some other way that we come to this idea of certainty? And so that's what we're going to talk about tonight. Should be an easy night. A lot of this material is not difficult. So I know that we've had some difficult weeks where I've thrown a lot at you. For the first half, a lot of this should be review. And then the second half, when we talk about certainty, you'll catch on to this really quickly. So, right away, starting with knowledge, and we talk about epistemology and evidence. We've talked a lot about epistemology and evidence, excuse me, in this class so far. And just to remind you, if you don't know what epistemology is, you need to remember that, because that is a word you're going to continually come up against in apologetics, any kind of apologetic literature. But epistemology is the philosophical study of knowledge. How do we know what we know? And I want to make, again, epistemology, philosophy of knowledge, I want to make the point there are numerous types of Christian epistemologies. Now, I'm going to list 5 of them here for you. You do not need to remember these, okay? This is just example to show you the kind of broad tent that Christians sit under in order how they explain how we know what we know. Again, we need to be charitable with each other in these kinds of issues, because not every Christian agrees with these types of issues. It's hard to derive exact biblical prescriptions on what we should believe about these things. And so we're kind of giving it our best, I don't want to say guess, but we're putting our best foot forward based on biblical data and trying to get an idea of where the Bible leads us, but not everybody agrees on that. And so one of the epistemologies we've already talked about is evidentialism. We've talked about evidentialism as an apologetic approach. It is fueled by an evidentialist epistemology that evidence must be provided to have true beliefs. If we are going to gain knowledge and have true beliefs based on that knowledge, we must have evidence to provide knowledge of those beliefs. There's another one, and again, you don't need to remember these names. It's not super important. You may, in a blue moon, come across these. There's another one called phenomenal conservatism. You're probably not going to come across this one because it's largely a Roman Catholic system, but its belief is justified if something seems true to the person. All right. I don't want to go into all the details of that. There can be a lot of problems with it, but it is an epistemology that some Christians hold, and it has some ties to Reformed epistemology. The real difference in phenomenal conservatism and Reformed epistemologies, one is held by Roman Catholics and the other is held by Protestants. And so that, and kind of their origination theologically of where they get these epistemologies is a little different, but they hold a lot of similar beliefs. We already talked about Reformed epistemology. It's actually also called proper functionalism. I don't know how they get these names. Don't ask me. I'm not a philosopher, but it says that belief in God does not need to be justified with evidence. All right. We've talked about that before. Another one we're going to talk about tonight is covenantal epistemology. It's where it says knowledge of God is only specially revealed and then better understood by reason. Now that kind of sounds like our idea of Augustine's faith-seeking understanding. It's not quite the same, but it has a lot of similarities. But we will talk about that a little more tonight. And then there's another one called tradition-based perspectivalism. It's the guiding of traditions formulate knowledge. So all the traditions throughout history that kind of bubble their way to the top, they're the ones who form how we gain knowledge about the world. Again, you don't need to remember these. I just want to bring these to your attention. You may come across them in apologetics, you may not. 2 of these are heavily Roman Catholic epistemologies: phenomenal conservatism and tradition-based perspectivalism. Evidentialism kind of hops the fence between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism, and then Reformed epistemology and covenantal epistemology is largely held by Protestants. And so what I want to give an example. I want to shine light on this, that not all Christians think the same way about these kinds of topics. And so again, this calls for us to just to be humble, just to ask questions and understand that not everybody is coming from the same place, even if we profess Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. And so those are epistemologies that you may come across. Again, don't worry about memorizing them. But what I want to do here is I didn't set this one up right, but when we talk about epistemology, the question about evidence is, do we need evidence to have justified beliefs? Evidentialism would say yes. Now, we need to understand there are many variations and levels of evidentialism, but typically how this boils out is that evidentialists will say that the level of belief must have evidence that corresponds in strength. And so when you have a major belief, you have a very important or pivotal or central belief to your worldview, you need to have evidence that corresponds in the same type of strength. They will say that. However, the evidentialist runs into a problem with this because he plays right into the atheist's hand. Because an atheist will say that, belief in God is only justified if there is sufficient evidence for that belief. And we kind of ran in with, if you did the reading for this week by William K. Clifford, he talked about you should only believe things. In fact, it's immoral to believe things without sufficient evidence. But the evidentialist says the exact same thing as the atheist in this sense, is that belief in God is only justified by sufficient evidence. Is that true? I believe I've made the case multiple times in this class so far that that's not necessarily how it works. Not every belief that we hold needs to provide evidence. All right. Now, we can provide evidence and that can be helpful. All right. But there are certain beliefs that are just basic to what we believe. And we don't necessarily have to provide evidence to be justified in holding that belief. And so I want to go through this reformed epistemology real quick. We've talked about this already before, but it's a school of epistemology developed in the later half of the 20th century. We've said that before. Alvin Plantinga and Nicholas Walterstorff are the main kind of contributors to this school of thought. Alvin Plantinga really is seen as the main guy, but Nicholas Walterstorff, another Christian, another great writer and philosopher, he's also seen as very instrumental in this school of thought. And their central position is that belief in God is properly basic and does not require evidence. What they were really what these two guys and really their colleagues saw as a problem was that in philosophy there was a huge everybody was an evidentialist at the time. Everybody believed in evidentialism, that you could only believe something if you had proper evidence to back up that belief. And Plantinga and Walterstorff and their colleagues, they really stepped up and said, no, there are certain beliefs that people hold that do not require evidence, and they are still justified in holding that belief without evidence. And so we should not provide evidence for God's existence, but focus on justification for belief in God's existence. What that means is, instead of trying to provide proofs or arguments for God's existence, what they would say is, talk about why you are actually rationally justified for believing in God, because believing in God is actually basic to the human condition. It's basic to being a human person. All right. It's not something that is, you are not automatically irrational for believing in God, even if you cannot provide evidence for that belief. So that's what they were really trying to talk about. And there are many things that we know to be true that we cannot prove with evidence. One of those beliefs that Plantinga talks about in his famous book, God and Other Minds, is he talks about you cannot prove that all the people your close friends, your family, your spouse, your children, you cannot prove that those people have minds. But you would be crazy and I can't go into the long philosophy of why we can't prove other people have minds, but it's very difficult to establish that philosophically. But what Plantinga and Walterstorff would say is that you would be kind of crazy to say, well, no, this person doesn't have a mind. That we're just all part of, this is all internal to me. All these other people are made up. And I see we got a question here. Would the atheists be irrational in their lack of belief in God? So David, yeah, some apologists will say that the atheist is irrational, and based on this reformed epistemology position, they would say that the the foundational or properly basic belief is actually belief in God. And we'll talk about John Calvin and his sensus divinitatis, and how the divine sense is put into people at birth, that it's something that God puts into people, and so that they can sense their creator, and they have a sense of God implanted in them. And so it is actually irrational to deny that instead of, embracing it. So yes, that is, you're catching on very quickly there, David. That is a great question. But again, reformed epistemology, there are many things that we know that we cannot prove, or we don't even need to prove to be justified in holding that belief. And so I could say, and I've used this as an example, my wife loves me. It could be very difficult to come up with empirical physical proof about my wife loving me. Yet at the same time, I am not um, irrational for holding that belief without evidence. I'm justified in believing that my wife loves me in the absence of evidence. So there are many things like that, and we can talk about it, but that's the basic understanding of reformed epistemology. We've talked about this before, so I don't want to spend too much time on it. Example: other minds or relational love. Again, how can you prove that other people that you're in a relationship with really love you? You don't have to provide proof to actually, demonstrate that they love you. You are justified in holding a belief that other people you are in relationship with actually love you. And so those are just some examples. So that's reformed epistemology. Oh yes, in the sensus divinitatis, we talked about that very briefly. John Calvin is instrumental in kind of bringing this out, and this plays into covenantal epistemology as well. But John Calvin writes in Book One of the Institutes, he writes that there exists in the human mind, and indeed by natural instinct, some sense of deity, and that's the where we get the Latin sensus divinitatis. We hold to be beyond dispute. So there is a sense of deity in all human minds that is beyond dispute. Since God himself, to prevent any man from pretending ignorance, that means that man can't pretend that they just don't know God, that God didn't give him enough evidence. God has put that there in man so he cannot pretend ignorance, has endued all men with some belief of his Godhead. This is not a doctrine which is first learned at school. All right. So again, we see that denial of kind of evidentialism there, but one as to which every man is from the womb his own master, one which nature herself allows no individual to forget. So, to answer your question, and David, again, when you asked, would the under this view, would the atheist be considered irrational? Absolutely, because what he would be denying is the divine sense that is given to him by God himself. And he's turning his back on that divine sense. And he is actually trying to pretend ignorance, but he is not ignorant. He is not really ignorant because that divine sense is there. And this isn't just something that like only Calvinists believe. So I know that using John Calvin can kind of be like a red flag for some people. This isn't just like what Calvinists believe. Like Walter Storff is not a Calvinist at all. All right. Nicholas Walter Storff, who I talked about earlier, not a Calvinist at all. And it can be questioned whether or not Alvin Plantinga is one as well. Theologically, they're not Calvinists really, but they believe that there's something that John Calvin is onto something when he says that there is a divine sense implanted in man that does not allow man to pretend ignorance, but is put there so that man can detect at some level the Godhead. And so, and we see this idea in older theologies. We see it somewhat in Thomas Aquinas. We see it somewhat in Augustine, but it's really developed in John Calvin and John. So that is the reason why when you hear of Reformed epistemology, they're always using John Calvin to explain this, is because John Calvin really did a great job in laying out this divine sense. So that's
And then,
really kind of review on Reformed epistemology. Do we have any questions?
yeah, so, and it kind of runs along the line of David's question also. It sounds like, we talked several weeks back about this idea about general revelation and Romans 1, that, there's no excuse, because the evidence for God is all around us. And so is that where, is that Calvin's kind of his foundation, is Romans 1, or is it more going back to, say, Genesis 1, that we are created in the image of God, that is that where that sense of the divine essence, is coming in?
That's a good question, Rick. I don't know if I could answer that fully. I'd have to look that up and see what he cites there. Man, that is a great question. My inclination is to say Romans 1, because when we talk about general revelation and natural theology, those are the texts. Everybody talks about those. But I don't think I would, I don't think that means that we necessarily push Genesis aside. I think maybe they would go hand in hand, but I don't know for sure off the top of my head. Now, definitely, I think we could make a case that part of being made in the image of God is to have this divine sense put into us by God Himself, to recognize God Himself through parts of His creation, not in a salvific way, obviously, but to recognize that there is some sense of deity out there. And so I definitely think that an argument could be made for using both. Does that answer your question, Rick?
Yes, thanks.
And I see there's someone put a question up in the chat. You guys are chatting me up. Those that disagree with this view, what are their reasons? So do you mean like those who disagree with Reformed epistemology, Alex?
Oh, sorry. I guess I should have just spoken up. No, my question was with I'm gonna butcher this, the sensus
Divinitatis.
I feel like Harry Potter right now. Yeah, so that's a view I've always grown up with, and I have not always considered myself to be Reformed. I grew up in kind of like a traditional Baptist church, and that was kind of something we all agreed on. And not until recently did I kind of find out that there's people that hold a different perspective. I'm just not sure, why would someone, or Christians, I should say, not believe that we're created with the sense that, God is real? You know what? Maybe I don't really know how to ask the question.
No. I think I understand what you're saying. Like, I mean, it seems almost kind of plain. I mean, it seems almost kind of like, yeah, that's pretty obvious to me. And so, like the sensus divinitatis makes sense. Like Calvin's idea of a divine sense just seems apparent to me. And so I think what you're saying is it kind of just is apparent to you as well. So why would Christians deny it, or how do Christians deny it? Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that
is he asking if someone who is already a Christian denies this, what Calvin is saying, or is he asking the pre-converted individual if they believe that this could be a possibility? Okay. I think that's two different.
Yeah, I thought he was asking if Christians didn't believe it. What can you clarify, Alex?
Yeah, sorry about that. Let me clarify. I'm talking about Christians. I understand the argument why the unbeliever would obviously deny that.
Mm-hmm.
But among Christians, do other Christians hold a different perspective on this, or is it kind of like an orthodox position?
So I would argue that it is a orthodox position that has been reformulated in the last 70 years and has become really apparent and just really forceful. Not everybody agrees with it. We're going to see in covenantal epistemology that there is a little variation to it, but at the same time, I don't think that people necessarily disagree with it based on just that, Calvin says it and or it's not there. I think a lot of people, whatever they want to call it, believe, a lot of Christians believe in this kind of divine sense. And on one side, they may kind of brush it aside or dismiss it based on their ideas of general revelation and natural theology, that knowledge of God is only revealed to us through special revelation, and therefore this divine sense is so broken by sin that we really can't know anything about God through that divine sense. And that's almost where covenantal epistemology comes into. So that it almost becomes like a fideistic approach. At the same time, I would also say that an evidentialist can embrace this idea of a divine sense, but he's still going to say we need proof to justify our beliefs. So they're not mutually exclusive necessarily. What the Reformed epistemologist is going to argue is that we don't exclusively come to knowledge and true belief through evidence alone. There are things that we believe that are properly basic to our worldview, to our structure of knowledge. And belief in God is one of those. Therefore, we don't have to provide evidence for the existence of God to be justified in our belief, to be thought of as rational beings. Does that make sense?
Yes, that makes sense. So is it fair to say that general revelation is pretty much the same thing as what Calvin was describing, or are they different?
It would know. So general revelation is how God would reveal himself in creation. The divine sense would be man's ability to perceive that general revelation.
Got it. Okay.
Any other questions? These are great questions, guys. I know this is probably stuff that we're not familiar with and we haven't heard much of, but feel free to ask questions.
So Ben, just one final. So to say that humans, I mean, based on Calvin, have this innate concept, right? I mean, that doesn't get them anywhere near the cross, and I think we've debated that.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So based on that, I mean, how significant or insignificant is to have that model, if that person never hears their price? Like, who cares at that point, whether or not they think that there's a guy, because they don't understand who that deity is, right? So I just don't know, I mean, it's fine to say that we all have this innate sense, but what difference does it make at the end of the day if that's as far as, and then maybe you're only speaking in terms of not having to prove the existence.
Yes.
And if that's the case, okay, fine. But, to drill into that, what value is there in admitting that everybody has this innate existence of God, if that's as far as it ever gets them?
Gotcha. So we're getting a little bit off topic with that, but I'd be happy to, that's more of a no, it's absolutely fine. This is great. This is more of a theological question. It doesn't necessarily pertain to apologetics. So there's kind of different ways we can understand this divine sense. For Reformed epistemology, it kind of gets us to the point where we can say belief in God is properly basic, where we don't have to provide evidence to be justified in our belief. On the other side, the theological side of the divine sense, what Calvin said, and really, and it's not just Calvin. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to throw up red flags because Calvin can be kind of a controversial name for some people. This is in Augustine, this is in Aquinas. So this is pretty orthodox theology. Calvin is used because he presents it so well. All right. But Calvin will say that the divine sense exists theologically because then the unbeliever has no excuse for denying God. Therefore, God is justified in condemning persons to an eternity of damnation because of that. Because that divine sense has been denied in a person, God is justified. He is not just necessarily picking or choosing people. It is really a turning away from the divine sense that allows God to govern the way that he does. So I really don't want to get into that. I think that would be a great thing to talk about off of this class. We could talk about that more theologically, but that would be, if you're asking the question, so what does this have to do with other stuff? Really, when Calvin talks about the divine sense, he's talking also about God uses that to justify, him giving eternal punishment to people. And that can be seen as both frightening, but also sobering that, people are without excuse. It's not just John Calvin who believes this. Augustine believed it. And this is where we come into with Paul in Romans 1 and 2, where Paul talks about people are not without excuse. And so that plays a huge part into why Calvin thought the way he thought about the sensus divinitatis. So any other questions? Did that clear up some things for you, David?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
So
Any other
Meat
questions?
pizza.
Would part of that be, part of that answer also be that, if you have this knowledge of God, divinity, whatever you want to call it, that I think it maybe is a different way of saying what you said, is that, so what do you do with that knowledge now, that revelation that you've received? And to me, that would lead one to worship, right? And so maybe that's just a different way of saying what you said.
Yeah, I definitely think if we're going to take it to that kind of level, yeah, the divine sense is put there. I don't know exactly what Calvin would say on that, but I would say, yeah, that seems very logical and theological to believe that the divine sense is put there to bring us to worship God. And so I don't see any problems with saying something like that. Any other questions, guys? All right, so let's talk about covenantal epistemology. And I want to mention this school of epistemology because we go to a Reformed church. All right, we have your pastors are theologically reformed. If you pick up any books on apologetics within that Reformed vein, they're either going to talk about Reformed epistemology or covenantal epistemology. So I just want to kind of make you aware of these so that you know what you're talking about when you run across it. I don't necessarily buy into covenantal epistemology, but it is an option there. But it's epistemology most associated with Reformed or Presbyterian theology. It agrees with the Reformed epistemology that knowledge of God is properly basic. So we don't need to provide evidence for the existence of God. Belief in the existence of God is properly basic, and we are justified in believing in God without evidence. It agrees with Reformed epistemology there. However, covenantal epistemology states that knowledge of God is implanted in humans by God. And so it's a little different. So, and I will explain this more. So Reformed epistemology will say that we have a divine sense implanted into us where we can sense God out in his general revelation, where covenantal epistemology says no, that divine sense is actually knowledge of God implanted. And I've before I was using both kinds of, I was saying implanted and innate, or you perceive divine knowledge. There is a little bit of difference here, and they will say that this divine sense is directly implanted into humans by God. It's not just a sense that allows us to perceive God out in his creation, it's actual knowledge given to us. And so the sensus divinitatis is actual knowledge. But they say that this knowledge is denied because of sin nature, that we are so depraved in our sin that we deny this knowledge. And so what I want to do is we're going to take a look at how these come together. So Reformed and covenantal epistemologies compared. And so far, what I've said about covenantal epistemology, I generally agree with. Both utilize the sensus divinitatis, or the divine sense. Reformed epistemology understands the sensus divinitatis to be a faculty or a sense of the mind. It's something that helps us perceive God in nature, or in his creation, in his general revelation. Covenantal epistemology understands the divine sense to be direct knowledge of God implanted into us innately. And I know that's kind of like splitting hairs, but when you get these folks together in the same room, they're going to talk about their differences. And I'll tell you in a minute why that difference is significant. Both have Reformed theological origins. However, Reformed epistemology really kind of ends its relationship with Reformed theology at its origin. It uses John Calvin. Reformed epistemology uses John Calvin to explain this divine sense and why people are justified in holding belief in God without having to provide evidence. But after that, it's really not Reformed in its thinking. It doesn't have to be. It's not set out as a purely Reformed theological position. It's just trying to answer the problem of evidentialism. So don't think that that's a bad thing. If you're super Reformed in your theology, that's not necessarily a bad thing. It just doesn't have any more use for Reformed theology after it answers the question of evidentialism. But covenantal epistemology is completely Reformed throughout. In fact, I recently read a book on just different types of Christian epistemologies, and the section on covenantal epistemology is just it's like reading theology. It was not like reading philosophy at all. It was thoroughly theological. It was super biblical. It was very refreshing to read it. It was great, and it was very understandable because it was so biblical. But at the same time, it's very Reformed throughout. Both are theories of knowledge, but Reformed epistemology is often used for philosophical problems of knowledge. I just mentioned that, where Reformed epistemology kind of ends its relationship with Reformed theology at John Calvin. Um, Again, that's because it's just trying to answer certain philosophical problems. It has no more allegiance to Reformed theology after that. Covenantal epistemology is actually better utilized, I think, as a theology rather than a philosophy. It's better utilized to try to answer certain theological questions. Now, the main difference comes in is where both of these schools of thought are using John Calvin's divine sense to explain their theories of knowledge. They are both using that divine sense. Reformed epistemology says the divine sense is a faculty or a sense of the mind. Covenant epistemology says that it is direct knowledge of God. You can disagree with me, but I am going to present why I am less inclined to go the covenantal epistemology route. And that's because usually, and I can provide an essay for this by someone who embraces this view, Scott Oliphant. He's a great apologist and a philosopher, if anybody's interested in reading about that. But usually guys who adhere to covenantal epistemology, what they're going to say is that man is so broken and depraved from his sin that he cannot pick up any kind of general revelation out there in the world. He cannot perceive God through general revelation at all. Not even we've been very careful in this class to say that we cannot learn about God through general revelation in a salvific way, but um, John Calvin was very open, and with him other thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, like Augustine, they were very open to the idea that God reveals himself generally through his creation, and certain things about God can be known through that general revelation. These are not salvific things. These are not things that bring people to faith in Jesus Christ, but they are things that can be known. And so the Reformed epistemology side kind of picks up that sense where people can know things about God through his general revelation. Covenantal epistemology takes a little different approach where we talked about Karl Barth back in the second week, who completely denied general revelation. Covenantal epistemology gets very close to doing that, where they don't deny general revelation as a theological category, but they flat out deny that it can be used by any unbeliever for any kind of knowledge of God. Even to say God exists, they would say it just doesn't happen. And so I am not totally sold on that position. I think there's a lot of good things about covenantal epistemology that I agree with, but I cannot go so far to say we cannot know anything about God just by looking at his general revelation. I don't think that is the historic orthodox position of the church. You can disagree with me. That's okay. Like I said, we are all going to disagree on these types of things. However, that's just where I stand on this. But I wanted to bring these two epistemological systems to you because, again, we go to a theologically reformed church. If you read books about apologetics in that reformed vein, you're going to come across one of these two epistemologies. And so I wanted to give you a little heads up as to what you see and what the difference is and how these thinkers approach knowledge of God. Does anybody have any questions about that? I gave you a lot there. So any questions
Hey,
about those two?
hey, Ben,
Yeah.
does the church take a stance on one or the other, or probably don't hold fast to one or the other necessarily, or do they?
As far as sacred mission,
Yeah.
I don't know.
Okay.
I think, I don't want to speak for any of the elders. I know that conversations I've had with one, he would seem to agree more with what I just presented to you. Again, there's a lot of good things in covenantal epistemology. I don't want to say it's terrible and heretical or anything like that. I think it just goes a degree further than I can accept. Um, and that's just me personally. If you happen to agree with it, I have no problems with that. I think it'd be great to discuss it. I think it's one of these open hand issues that we can disagree on and we can discuss and sharpen each other, and that's okay. But I don't know for sure if anybody has. I don't, honestly, I don't know if any if any of the elders are like familiar with these two epistemologies that I just presented to you. They may be, they may not. I honestly don't know. Does that answer your question, David?
Yes, thanks.
Yeah. Now, I will tell you that I have taught in a church before, where they came down hard on the covenantal side, and I had to teach out of a book that I didn't necessarily want to teach out of, but that's okay. You know, that's fine. There's room for that. So Any other questions? Is there anybody in the, nope. Okay. All right. So we're going to move on. So we talked about epistemology. Those epistemology were just kind of to whet your appetite, to get you a little bit of knowledge of what you're dealing with. The problem of certainty here, this is going to be really important because this is actually a tool that you will be able to utilize going out and having conversations apologetically. So whereas epistemology was really to edify you, to help you understand what you may be reading in other books, this is something that you can utilize, I think, practically. It's gonna be a little heady, but you will catch on pretty quickly. So the question often gets asked, and I'm coming from this from a reformed epistemology perspective, but does reformed epistemology offer enough certainty for belief in God? I've said continually over and over again on this class that the position is that belief in God is basic. It does not require evidence for you to be justified in believing in God and to be considered a rational human being. The question then is, if we have that view, are we then offering ourselves enough certainty for belief in God? And so, objection, reformed epistemology does not offer certainty in beliefs that are basic. Are we absolutely certain about this basic belief? And so what my answer would be, and again, this, if I talked about this book a couple weeks ago, but Ron Nash's book, Faith and Reason, he spells this out wonderfully. Again, I would recommend having that book for all of your shelves. That is just a great book to reference. But talks about we do not need evidence for beliefs that are basic. We already established that. So the question, are arguments for God's existence then coercive? You know, if we present arguments for the existence of God, do they necessitate that people would then believe in the existence of God? So if I offer you an argument, let's say we'll do the cosmological argument, all right? And we're going to actually get into that the next time we meet. We're going to talk about the different arguments for God's existence. But if I offer you an argument, let's say the cosmological argument for God's existence, and I lay it out so well, does that necessarily mean you have to believe in God once I give you that argument? And I would say, absolutely not. Do arguments require people to believe in God with certainty? No. And I think you know that in the back of your minds. You may have never thought about it before, but no, arguments for God's existence do not require people to believe in God with certainty. And this is kind of a hill that I will die on, because not so much because I believe it so wholeheartedly, but because I see a lot of young people who do apologetics really abuse people and hurt people because they just hammer people with arguments about God's existence, and they really don't spend enough time listening to the unbeliever, listening to the non-believer. And they don't, and these people who will just hammer non-believers with arguments, they don't understand that arguments do not require people to believe in God with certainty. They're not designed to give a certain type of certainty called logical certainty, which we'll talk about in a minute. So if you don't take anything else away from this topic tonight, just remember, when you provide arguments for God's existence and people don't believe it, that's okay, because they are arguments for God's existence. They're not coercive. The insistence on evidence demonstrates a misunderstanding of the role of certainty. So what I mean by that is that when we continue to demand evidence for people to be absolutely certain of their belief system, or if people continually demand evidence from us for our belief in God, we misunderstand what it means to be certain about a belief that we hold. And I'm going to explain what that means. And so if you guys did the reading this week, and I hope you did. If you didn't, that's okay. I know that the Clifford essay, it's a bit dated. And so he's got some interesting language in there. But William K. Clifford was a mathematician and philosopher. He was not a friend of Christianity. One of the pivotal statements that you'll read really anywhere that talks about him as a philosopher, he says that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And so when we look at the title of his essay, The Ethics of Belief, Clifford was making an argument that it's not just wrong intellectually to believe things on insufficient evidence. Clifford was arguing that it is morally wrong to believe anything without evidence. And so if you read the essay, you will remember the ship owner narrative. If you didn't, I'm going to explain it real quick. But the ship owner narrative is kind of his example that he gives on why it is always wrong to believe anything without sufficient evidence. And so he tells this story of a man who owned a ship, and it was ferrying people. I can't remember if it was going across the sea or what. And it was told to the man that his ship was not seaworthy, that there were concerns about, whether or not his ship would survive another voyage. However, the man dismissed that evidence per se, and he believed, you could say something like he believed in his heart, or he felt good about the belief that his ship would survive, that there was nothing really wrong with it. And instead, what he did was, instead of fixing the ship and making repairs, he put people on there. He sent them on a voyage, and the ship was actually broken. It wasn't fit for the sea, and the ship sank, and everybody on board died. And so Clifford argues that obviously the ship owner is immoral because he's presented with evidence that his ship is not seaworthy, and he is the cause of those people's death. He could have prevented it, but he sent those people out there in a ship that was not ready for the sea, and they all died because of his lack of acting. I think we would all agree with that. That's really a kind of nothing that surprises us. However, he takes it a step further, and I think we would agree with this too. He says it is also immoral if the ship owner had the evidence and he still sent people out there, but the ship survived and it made it to its destination. That ship owner would still be acting immoral because in the face of all that evidence that he has, he still goes on his belief, his positive beliefs, and sends people out onto the sea in the ship. And again, I think we would agree with that. We would agree with that statement that it is immoral for him to send people out on that ship when he knows that it is, there's trouble. What Clifford does at this point is he makes a jump from those two propositions where he says that it's immoral because the people died in the ship, and as well as it's immoral to send people out even if they make it. He makes the jump to say it's always wrong to believe anything on insufficient evidence. The problem is that not every case of what we believe pans out like his ship owner narrative. We don't always have someone who tells us the specifics of what's wrong with the ship or how it could sink or something like that. And so philosophers have been very negative towards Clifford's kind of assessment of believing anything on insufficient evidence. But if we really think about his analogy and how this works, there are all kinds of things that we believe that don't have any kind of evidence, that don't have what he would call sufficient evidence. And so I kind of scratch my head at this narrative. It doesn't necessarily follow the argument. It doesn't really prove his point. And we got a question here. Hold on just a second. To help point out the immorality, he says that the ship owner, to help point out the immorality, he says the ship owner collected the insurance for the ship and didn't mention again. Yes, I forgot to mention that. Yeah, very true, Will. So, but the whole point of that is just his ship owner narrative doesn't follow, it doesn't necessitate his statement here that it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence, because not every belief or instance in life is like this ship owner narrative. It just doesn't always play out that way. And so it doesn't necessarily, you can't think of, I can't think of a way to formulate, I believe in the existence of God, into something that matches the ship owner narrative. It just doesn't. How is that immoral? How is, in the same sense that the ship owner is acting immoral? It's not. It doesn't necessarily follow. That is a huge problem that philosophers have been pointing out about this essay since the very beginning. But the reason why I had you read this is that Clifford is actually very important in this idea of certainty and evidence, because he kind of set the bar philosophically for a while, and how everybody approaches, every kind of belief, where you got to provide evidence. You have to have evidence for what you believe in. You have to have evidence. And it's just not a really good argument. It's just, it's taken people captive, and it's not very good philosophy. So there's a misunderstanding that everything believed must be proved by evidence. This leads to a misunderstanding of certainty. The saying would go that you can only be certain about beliefs if you have enough evidence, and that's just simply not true. All right, there are many things that we believe in everyday life that we have no evidence for, but we are positively certain that they are happening or that they exist. And so evidence cannot provide proof and certainty for all beliefs. And we're going to go over a few of those. There are many things we believe without evidence. There are many things that we believe that are not logically, let me move this here, not logically certain. And so that's important right there. Logical certainty. And we're going to get into this in the next slide. There's a difference between what we would call logical certainty and psychological certainty. And again, if you buy the Nash book, he talks about this at length, and it would be worth your money to get his book. So there are two types of certainty that we're dealing with in philosophy usually, and in apologetics. There's logical certainty. Logical certainty belongs to the fields of mathematics, geometry, and formal logic. These beliefs do not require. Wait, hold on. I think I messed up there. Oh yeah, these beliefs do not require evidence. So 7 + 5 = 12. We got which is the law of mathematics. You don't have to, you don't have to provide evidence for that. We know that's how that works there. No object can be both round and square at the same time and in the same sense. That's the law of non-contradiction. You can't have a circle be a square and a square be a circle at the same time in the same sense. That's a pretty basic philosophical example they use. Ronald Reagan was either the 40th president of the United States or he was not. That's called the law of the excluded middle. There's no middle ground there. He wasn't not the 40th president of the United States, or he was the 40th president of the United States. There's no middle ground to argue there. So these are built on logical certainty. And the problem is that a lot of people will take logical certainty and think that we need to apply that kind of certainty to every belief that we hold in our lives. And that's just not possible all the time. So a lot of people will say, well, you need to have logical certainty in your belief in God. Well, is that really possible? Is that something that we can apply one of these logical laws to and come away with an appropriate answer? And so one of the great critiques or one of the great philosophical ramblings about this was by David Hume. We'll actually read something by David Hume in a couple weeks. He made a famous statement where he was talking about belief in God, and he said, if any belief does not have any kind of mathematical evidence or any kind of empirical evidence or any kind of just logic to it, commit it to the fire because it's a false belief. Well, the problem with what David Hume said about in that essay about false beliefs is that his own writing would fall, victim to his own categories there, that he did not have any kind of logical evidence and any kind of logical certainty for what he was writing. So his actual writing should be submitted to the fire. So you can get yourself into a lot of problems if you demand this kind of logical certainty to every belief that you hold in your life. But there's another kind of certainty when we call it moral or psychological certainty. And this is certainty for everyday beliefs that are not necessarily logical in nature, where the laws of logic cannot be directly applied to them. And so I've used this before. My wife loves me. I cannot provide you logical certainty that people that you are in relationship with love you. That's just not something we can do. But here are some other ones. The elevator that I am riding will not fall. All right. So you could try to do this sometime, but think about this. If you were to walk onto an elevator and you had to come up with logical certainty, evidence that verified every bit of logical certainty, you would never be able to ride an elevator because it would require so much just evidence and so much studying, and it would take you years to become logically certain that nothing is wrong with that elevator. Yet people walk on elevators every day without having that kind of logical certainty, and they are justified in their beliefs. They are justified in getting on that elevator. They are justified in having psychological certainty that that elevator will not fall. Now, does that mean that some elevators, does that mean that elevators never fall? No, accidents happen, terrible things happen, but you are well justified for believing that the elevator you are going to ride will not fall. You are not irrational for having this kind of psychological certainty for riding an elevator. In fact, what you could say is that you might be considered irrational if you expected to have evidence for every little minute detail about the elevator and tried to build a case for that logical certainty. You would go crazy trying to do that. And so another example, the sun will rise tomorrow. Could the world end and the sun may not come up tomorrow? Yes, sure. But we're pretty certain that the sun is going to rise tomorrow. This is not something that can necessarily be proved logically. It's just we have this kind of moral or psychological certainty that it's going to happen. And so my conclusion in this, and you can use this as a tool, but it's misplaced for the non-believer to ask the Christian to provide logical certainty for his beliefs through evidence. All right. And I think you've probably already picked up on that. Use this as a tool if you are engaged in an apologetic conversation where a non-believer demands that you provide logical certainty for belief in God. I think you are well justified in saying, I can't. That is not something I can do. But let me tell you, I believe there are many things that you and I do every day that we believe in, beliefs that we hold, that we don't have any kind of logical certainty, but we have a psychological certainty. We would otherwise be thought of as irrational if we did not think they were going to happen. And so I think, so those are the types of certainty and what we're talking about: logical certainty and moral or psychological certainty. And before I move on, does anybody have any questions on these? I know I covered a lot there.
So Ben, and I hate to monopolize my questions,
You're
I
fine.
apologize, but so if we're suggesting that there's an innate instinct, right?
Mm-hmm.
Then what do we do with that person who, are they falsely denying the existence of God? Are they begging the question of what we're theorizing? And if they're not, and they actually do believe that there's no God, then where do we go from there? Because obviously you don't want to get into a debate and go down that evidential rabbit hole. So, I mean, it seems to me that it could be a non-starter, unless they're truly seeking, right?
Yeah.
And maybe they're more agnostic.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a good
So I'm
question,
just,
David. So
yeah,
I'm actually going to talk about that in the next slide, but that doesn't. So these, and I've presented a very one-sided kind of argument to how we don't need evidence to be justified in our belief for God. That doesn't mean we don't have to provide any. That doesn't mean that we can't provide any. We most certainly can. But what I really wanted us to get to the point of understanding is that, for one, belief in God is basic to being a human. There is a divine sense in us, whether we believe that is innate knowledge implanted or it is a sense that can perceive God's revelation out in nature. There is a divine sense in us that God has put there, that where we can use the evidence and we are without excuse of a basic knowledge of Him. Also, we are justified in believing in God because of that divine sense. We are justified in believing in God without having to provide any kind of evidence, for that belief. And we don't have to present any kind of logical certainty that, relies on, any kind of mathematics or logic or anything like that. We don't have to have that kind of precision of certainty when we hold that belief, but we have a psychological certainty that relates to how kind of some of the other beliefs we hold in everyday life. None of that of what I've presented so far denies that we can use evidence. In fact, I will make the case, and in fact, that's really what the rest of this class, not just this class tonight, but the rest of our weeks that we have going forward, talking about presenting evidence. I've been making the case the last few weeks, the first 5 weeks of this class. We don't have to just approach this with evidence and hammer people with evidence ad nauseum. We don't have to have that to be justified in our belief. But at the same time, we can provide arguments, we can provide proofs, we can have conversations that point to historical findings about, different things that are contested in scripture. So that we can use evidence. It's just that our belief does not, um, does not fall based on the level of evidence we provide. Does that make sense, David?
So I guess for me, a conversation with somebody who doesn't believe that way, and I guess I would agree with Calvin that we do have this divine sense, and I believe in natural theology or general revelation that there is no excuse for unbelief. So first, if I'm talking with somebody like that, my approach is I can't prove the existence of God. I don't feel a need to prove the existence of God. So I share the gospel and let the Spirit do the work, rather than, try to have some philosophical argument. I mean, is that maybe that blows the need for apologetics right out of water? I don't know, but is that a valid response?
I think it's a very valid response, Rick. That is something that I've tried to talk about that in the first week, where John Frame gave the quote that apologetics is part of evangelism. It's never absent from presenting the gospel, and I think we would be hard pressed theologically. And we talked about this way back in week 2 when we talked about, can we present a natural theology, or another word for natural theology, really just apologetics? Can we present a natural theology that brings people to a salvific belief in God? And I would say, no, we can't. And I don't think, and even though Thomas Aquinas is considered the father of natural theology, he didn't even believe that. And he gives a lot more credit to reason, to human reasoning, than, Protestants do. So I would agree with that. And and a lot of apologists will say, the most response they get from people, from unbelievers, is sharing their testimony, sharing their gospel testimony. They have their minute long testimony built up, and they know how to deliver it really quickly. And that's where they really get a spark from, because the Spirit is working in that. What apologetics can do, on one side, it can be used for believers to help strengthen our faith, to understand that we are not irrational in believing what we believe. We don't just come to faith with this blind kind of faith. There's a lot that our reason plays. There's a lot to say about our reason playing into our faith. And so there's a very real understanding of using apologetics as faith seeking understanding. Like I talked about last week with Augustine, we come to faith about the Trinity, or we come to believe in the Trinity through faith, but we try to use our reason to better understanding it. And I think that's a legitimate way apologetics can be used within the body of Christ, but also as an outreach, and say, hey, we do have good reasons for believing what we believe. And if you want to lead off with the gospel, I very much commend that. I think that is great. You're always going to have objections, and trying to answer those objections from the non-believer, that's where we can get into using arguments, using proofs, and using our different tactics that we're going to learn throughout the rest of this class. So that was a long answer, but do you guys feel that was an adequate answer for the questions that you had?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a combination, probably. I don't know that anybody just through reason, comes to faith. It's it's the Spirit working through the proclamation of the gospel as well. So it's probably a combination.
Yeah, absolutely. I would very much theologically agree with that. All right, so we just really have one little section to talk about here, and we kind of already been talking about it because of those questions, and then we'll be done. So certainty in natural theology. So whoever just put a question on there, I'll get it at the end of this slide. So arguments for God's existence are not coercive, as they are not logically certain. So I've already talked about this a little bit. Just because I provide an argument for God's existence does not mean that people have to believe in the existence of God. They are not logically certain. They are not coercive. All right. So then what do? Well, at the same time, belief in God can be psychologically certain. I am justified in believing in God and not necessarily having to provide evidence for it, because, well, that belief is properly basic. It is, I am not considered irrational for holding that belief. So therefore, arguments for God's existence can provide psychologically certainty. However, at best, these arguments are person relative. Now, this is something I want to really stress, because we're going to start learning about arguments for God's. I think that's what next week is. Arguments for God's, or not next week, in 2 weeks when we meet again. Arguments for God's existence are person relative. What I mean by that, and again, Ron Nash talks about this a lot. Arguments for God's existence are not coercive. They don't require people to believe in God's existence. However, they can be used as tools to take down barriers of unbelief. And so some arguments for God's existence will resonate with people more than other arguments. So we're going to go through, I don't know, 5 or 6 arguments next week, and I'm going to explain them and how they work, where they come from. I have certain arguments that I really like. I really like an argument called the ontological argument. It was first conceived by Anselm, and it has been reformulated numerous times. I love that argument. It speaks to me for some reason. I do not like the teleological argument, arguments about purpose or design or anything like that. They don't resonate with me as well. And that could just be a result of how I think about things or how my mind works. What we need to understand as we embark in adding more tools to our toolbox to use for apologetics is that we can't just hammer people with arguments. Not every argument is going to work for every person. So if you get really good at explaining the cosmological argument to people and using that as a proof for God's existence, don't get upset if not every person resonates with that. It's just not going to work for everyone. Now it's a good argument, and I believe it does provide good evidence for God's existence, but it just doesn't persuade everyone. And so that's really what we mean by person relative. Think of arguments for God's existence or proofs for God's existence as tools. If one tool doesn't work, you take another one out of your toolbox and you use it. If that tool doesn't work, you take another one out of your toolbox and you use it. What this does, though, if we approach natural theology, if we approach apologetics in this kind of light, it takes the pressure off of our philosophical reasoning, and it really puts the center of our apologetic conversations on the working of the Holy Spirit. And so that is exactly what Rick was talking about. We can lead with the gospel, and I would encourage you to do that, and then take down barriers to belief through these proofs and through these arguments. Use them as tools and rely on the Spirit of God to work those in different people and in different ways. And so that's what we mean by arguments are person relative. Arguments for God's existence are tools, not necessities. All right. And so the question of natural theology, is it not necessary to first prove God's existence through general revelation to proceed to theology of special revelation? We talked about that way back in week 2. No, it's not. You don't prove God through evidence first and then believe in him salvifically. We come to God. I very much believe in this faith seeking understanding. We come to believe through the working of the Holy Spirit. We come to faith in Christ, and then we work through a lot of these tougher things of theology with our abilities of reasoning. And so that's everything I have for tonight. Let's see here. Can we have logical certainty without evidence? Yeah. So that's a good question, Alex. Can we have logical certainty without evidence? Yeah, so the law, for example, it's really hard to provide evidence for the law of non-contradiction. And that's what I meant on that slide when I said that, logical certainty does not necessarily need evidence. I can't get evidence to prove the law of non-contradiction. It's just there. A square cannot be a circle in the same place or in the same time. That's a contradiction. All right. And so I can't get evidence to prove that law, but I can get evidence to kind of build the case up for that. And so usually when we talk about logical certainty and evidence in the same sentence, it's that people are looking for that kind of mathematical precision of certainty in their belief systems, especially in dealing with belief about God. And that's just not possible. That's not necessarily where we arrive at. We don't have that kind of logical certainty with God's existence. It's more of a psychological or moral certainty. So, any other questions? You guys have had great questions tonight, by the way. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, I'm gonna end this and